So thanks again for coming. Our role in the Coombs Forum is to help enhance public policy by strengthening the links between researchers and government. And although the title of today's talk might look a little bit one way, it might look like, well, it probably doesn't look one way actually on the picture. The title is a little bit research push, right? It's sort of pathways to policy impact. But really this talk, the genesis of this presentation, was for a government audience and for work we're doing with government, looking at the sort of design and policy around research impact assessment at the national level. And this was a talk that I did while I was working on secondment in the Department of Innovation last year. And really what we wanted to do today was to broaden the discussion a little bit with a whole range of people from around the university and also from government, from other government departments outside the innovation and industry department. So I think from looking down the list, we've got a really great mix of people from all over the place here today, and thanks again for coming. Okay, cool. So as I'll cover today, the issue of research impact assessment is a sort of a hot topic right now, and maybe the fact that we've got a full room is an indicator of that. It's important for government, as I'll explain, and it's also really important within the research community. And I want to talk about an aspect of that, one aspect of that, which is this idea of policy impact, or the idea, or the ways in which research creates impact in government and in policy. And before I start, I should warn you that I don't have a simple answer. I'm not going to tell you how to have an impact in policy, and I don't have a simple set of metrics. In fact, one of the things we've been doing as part of the project that I'm going to talk about today is looking at the ways in which people in other countries are thinking about this idea of policy impact. And I have to say that no one really has a simple framework or a simple set of metrics that I've been able to find anywhere in the world. So part of my introduction is to say that it's complicated, but hopefully today we'll also get past it's complicated to some concrete and practical suggestions for how we might think about it within the university, within the Crawford School of Public Policy. How do we think about the impact of our work in government? But also how could government think about setting a national research impact measurement system and how that might affect the work that researchers do with people in government. So what is the government context for talking about research impact? I'll just give you a really quick snapshot by way of these three pieces of work that have been happening in government over the last year or two. Led out of the Department of Innovation, as you can see up the top. Come in and sit wherever you can. But concluding with work that was launched just before Christmas in the National Research Investment Plan, which really starts to encompass all of the research that the Commonwealth Government funds right across the full range of departments and portfolios and agencies. So in 2011, partly as a response to the introduction of the ERA system, which measures the quality of research in universities, there was a project and a paper released on the innovation dividend, if you like, or how government realises the innovation dividend from its significant investment in publicly funded research. And this report made the recommendation that actually ERA was important because we needed to be able to say something and have a systematic way of measuring quality of research in universities, but that actually universities and other publicly funded research agencies exist for more reasons than just producing quality research, and that in fact measuring impact might be a way to focus some attention on those other roles that are also important, and that if we just had a system that focused on measuring quality, it might skew behaviour. So that was the first government response to the introduction of ERA and thinking about this issue of measuring impact in a more systematic way right across the research system. 2012, just one example of a range of reports. This is the report of the non-government members of the Prime Minister's Manufacturing Task Force, which again made an explicit recommendation about impact measurement and impact assessment. And they saw impact assessment as a way of driving the right kinds of behaviour from their perspective, which was helping incentivise researchers to work more closely with industry, to realise sort of industry innovation outcomes from the public investment in research. So you have the government thinking about impact, and then you have a whole range of inquiries and reviews coming to a similar conclusion that actually if we could measure impact, it might drive desired kinds of behaviour in the research system. And then in the National Research Investment Plan, which as I said came out just before Christmas, if you didn't get to page 86, there's a section in there on the importance of impact assessment as part of a broader systematic approach to evaluating the return on investment for the considerable sums that the government puts into publicly funded research. So impact assessment in that context was seen as an important part of a much broader sort of planning and management and evaluation of the publicly funded research system. So what I've been saying to colleagues in the research community is that this document at the end basically says that it's the government's intention to introduce a research impact assessment scheme at the national level. So there's lots of people talking about research impact, and I think we need to continue that talking and improve the way we talk about impact, because in some form or another, research impact assessment at the national level, as they've introduced in the UK, is coming in Australia. So why focus on policy impact? So I'm in a slightly peculiar situation of working for both CSIRO and ANU here at the Crawford School, and in discussions with colleagues here and at CSIRO, we felt that both our organisations had a particular interest in thinking about demonstrating impact from our research, but also particularly thinking about the role of our organisations in working with and engaging with government and the impact of our research in government and in policy. And we felt that in the broader kind of impact assessment discussion, there wasn't much attention being focused specifically on the issue of policy impact. And we were wondering whether impact maybe is different in policy and in government. Maybe it should be understood differently, maybe it should be measured differently, and we didn't really know. And so we decided to put together a small collaborative project to look at this issue. And really, we're doing three things. One was last year we started by reviewing a whole range of relevant literature on the topic, and we drew from the research utilisation literature in the social sciences going back to the 70s. We looked at research and science policy literature, we looked at evaluation literature, and just trying to get a sense of how people think about this question to frame an initial discussion paper, which fingers crossed will be finished in the next month or so and available to you all if you're interested. The next thing we want to do, both in ANU and in CSIRO, is to start to pull together some case studies to look at how this has actually happened in practice and to have examples of different kinds of engagement and impact with government. And then what we want to do is sort of hold those case studies up against the lessons from the literature and think about what that tells us about how to measure and understand policy impact. So that's what we're doing, and as I say, we're sort of a few months into the process, and there's a bunch of people here and in CSIRO who've been involved. We're approaching the question of policy impact with sort of three lenses in mind. The first one is the question of pathways. What do we actually know about the various ways in which research and policy interact, and what are the pathways by which impact could be created from research? The second lens is, more broadly, what do we know about the relationship between research and policy, between knowledge and decision making? Because that, again, we hypothesise, will be an important facet of this broader question about how to measure the impact arising from those activities. And the final thing we wanted to touch on, because I think it's important, and again it's a little bit neglected sometimes in the impact discussion, is what do we know about best practice evaluation, and what can that tell us about how we might measure policy impact? So that's what we're doing, and the reason we're doing it is twofold, really. One is to help our own organisations think about this. CSIRO's more than $1 billion organisation. ANU is more than $1 billion organisation. There's a lot of research going on, and there's a lot of people who are already working with government or thinking that they would like to work with government. And we would like to hazard a guess that if you did a straw poll of researchers working in both institutions, there'd be quite a lot who think that they're having an impact in government and policy. And so we want to inform the way our organisations think about this, how they plan for it, how they manage for it, how they reward staff. And we're also hoping that the work that we're doing in this project will inform the work the government's doing on the design of a national research impact assessment system. And hopefully if those two things go hand in hand, you might have a system which starts to reinforce some of the desired behaviour back through funding and back through the system. So that's what we're doing. But where do we start in this whole question of policy impact? And what's the, if you stand back a little bit from research and policy, what's the dominant sort of metaphor for how these things work? And I would like to suggest that it's something like this. This is the gap, or the divide, or as Peter Shergold called it in his article, the chasm between the two cultures. And I have to say, having had a look at the literature on linking research and science and policy, there's a fairly negative tone that runs through a lot of the articles that we've looked at. There's this sense that there are these sort of systemic problems and barriers and gaps, and that really there's some great failing, and that, you know, a lot of good is getting lost in translation here in the middle. But I don't know if I really buy that. Having worked in CSIRO for 10 years and here at ANU for the last couple of years, admittedly this is anecdotal evidence, but I know of hundreds and thousands of researchers who spend an awful lot of time working with partners in government. I know a lot of people in government who spend an awful lot of time working with people in the research community. There's a lot going on. And maybe we don't measure it, maybe we don't have a way of accounting for it at the moment, but I'm not sure I necessarily buy this idea that over here there's knowledge and researchers, and over here there's government and politics and bureaucracy and policy, and that somehow all the good stuff is getting lost down the chasm in the middle. We, as part of our project, we've done a little bit of characterisation of CSIRO's investment in research. In CSIRO, if you want the organisation to invest in your research program, you have to fill in a science plan, and you also have to fill in an impact plan. And you have to say at the beginning of your program how you think the science you're doing will lead to impact and who you're going to partner with to make that happen. And when we last looked, there were 48 distinct programs within CSIRO, and 41 of them in their impact statements said something very explicit about the science they were doing being used or useful to people in government and to policy. So even if that's not all happening, at least 85% of CSIRO thinks that it's having an impact in government and policy. So something's going on, and there's more going on than I think this kind of metaphor allows for, but perhaps we don't have a good way of capturing that, or understanding the breadth of it, or understanding what people are actually doing, or rewarding people in their careers for doing this kind of work. So that's what we want to look at. The other point I just make before we get into the sort of the pathways to policy impact is really that thinking about this from the perspective of people in CSIRO and people in ANU, the other thing that jumps out at me is that different organisations have different ways of thinking about connecting research and policy. So to give you a concrete example, CSIRO, because it's a government research agency and part of the government research system, has access to cabinet documents as part of the normal work of government. And CSIRO scientists are quite often bringing their expertise to bear and providing input to draft cabinet documents and the sort of regular internal workings of government in a way that I think researchers in the university system, I mean, maybe it happens off the books, I'm sure it does, but not in the same structured way and formal way as it does in CSIRO. And on the other hand, a university, a school like the Crawford School, a university like ANU, has an enormously important role in training future and current public servants, and both through graduate education and professional development in a way that CSIRO doesn't. So the way we think about the impact of different research organisations in government and policy will be different depending on the different organisations. And so I think what we've tried to do is to take that diversity and try and think of a way of getting beyond this kind of metaphor, which I would argue is not particularly helpful to anyone, towards something that's a little bit more practical and useful. And how do we have a metaphor to replace the gap that can allow for the diversity of institutional role and diversity of, you know, the aims and objectives of different researchers within institutions. And so we've started thinking about this idea of pathways. And of course, we're not the only people in the world who are using the word pathways. Just to give you a quick example, this is from Research Councils UK. And of course, there's a lot of interchange of ideas and feedback between the Australian funding and impact assessment system and the UK model. The UK does have impact measurement as part of its research excellence and funding framework. And you can see now that that's been sort of implemented for a little while. For example, research councils starting to try and give guidance to researchers who receive funding about what kind of pathways to impact there might be. And I think the motivation behind this kind of language and the idea of pathways, you know, from talking to colleagues in the UK, is that I don't think the research councils are expecting that researchers can predict far in advance the impact of their work. And I think alongside that, there's an interesting question about what people can be held accountable for. And I don't think the research councils necessarily feel like individual researchers or research projects can or should be held accountable for impacts that might happen far in the future. But I think they do think that researchers can be held accountable for at least thinking about that when they're making proposals and asking for funding and implementing the projects that get funded. And so they've started to develop this idea of pathways as a way of helping researchers at least think through the logic of what they're trying to do and who they might partner with and what the pathways to impact might be. And so here you can see they've started to assemble a bunch of case studies about pathways to policy impact. And I have to say, having had a look at those case studies, it's a little bit it's a bit of a random grab bag still at the moment. There's a whole bunch of case studies of people who've received funding from the UK research councils who are sort of saying, well, I've got my funding and I think I'm going to have a big impact. And that's about as far as it goes. But they have started this discussion within their own system about, well, what might the pathway be? What might the steps along that pathway be? And how might we evaluate that you're using the money we've given you effectively? So this is it's a good place to start, but I think still needs a little bit more work. And what we're trying to do through our project is put some more flesh on the bones of this idea. One report that I think is worth a closer look, again from the UK, this is from the Natural Environment Research Council, and they produced this report a couple of years ago to help support researchers that they were funding to think about, okay, well, if you think your science or your research is going to have an impact in government and policy, what are the different pathways that it might follow? And how might we, as a funding council, give you some guidance and some support about thinking through that process? And I guess I should also just say that I'm sort of fairly loosely using the words research and science in an interchangeable way. There's an emphasis here on science and science policy, partly because of the fact that I'm working with CSIRO on this project, and there's, you know, as the National Science Agency, they've got to focus on science and science policy. I will come to the social sciences a bit later on, and I think that what we're saying about pathways to impact is just as relevant to all disciplines and all kinds of research. So forgive me a little bit of loose language as we go through here. So I'll just show you quickly an example of the kind of guidance that the Natural Environment Research Council is giving to scientists in the UK who've received funding. This is just 2 pages. Please don't feel that you have to read it all, it's just an example. There's page after page after page of this stuff in the report. So these are all the different ways, whether they be formal, informal, whether you're targeting the bureaucracy or parliament or politicians. There's all this information in this report about all the different ways that your science or your research could be used in government, could be useful to policymakers, could have an impact. And I think that's really helpful. If you're a scientist and you don't really know where to start and you don't really know how government works, this report is a really good resource. But what worries me a little bit about this approach is that, as I say, there's 57 pathways in this report. And how do I know which one to choose? Where do I start? No one has time to do everything. People are teaching and researching and being parents and everything else they do. No one has time to do all 57 pathways to impact. And this report is a little bit silent on the sort of trade-offs between going down different paths. And I think that's what we're really hoping to get at with our work, is going beyond a shopping list of policy impact to something which might actually help guide people a little bit, make some decisions about, well, where should I be putting my effort, given the kind of research I'm doing and the kind of policy that I'm trying to inform or influence, how do I know which kinds of pathways might be, likely to be more or less effective? And so that's what we're really trying to get to. This is a good start, but I think there's a lot more work to be done. And so what we've done is really gone back to basics a little bit and thought, well, what do we know about the relationship between science and research and policy? And how might that help us make some of these judgments about trade-offs and choices between different pathways? I'm just going to give you a couple of quick examples of relevant work. This is a report pulled together by colleagues in the US a couple of years ago. There's a focus in this report particularly on climate science and climate policy, but really what they were doing is sort of surveying 20-odd years of research into the links between climate science and knowledge and climate policy and decision making, and saying, well, what do we know about the links between knowledge and research and action in policy? And there's a focus here on what the authors call usable science, which I think is interesting, and we'll come back to that. I'd like to just say now, by way of kind of forestalling the question at the end, I'm not saying for a second that all science has to be usable or useful, but if you are trying to be useful, what do we know about how you might go about doing that? And the synthesis of the literature that these guys have come up with basically says that there's sort of 4 key factors in the usefulness and the usability of science for policy making, particularly when it comes to climate change. Usable science has to be credible, it has to be salient, and it has to be legitimate. And it also has to be sensitive to context. It has to be sensitive to the context of the decision maker, the policy maker. It's not enough to produce credible and salient knowledge, but that knowledge has to be contextualized by the decision maker in the context of the decision they're making, if that's not too tautological. Lisa Dilling has written extensively about the usefulness of climate science in climate policy and decision making. And she says, nearly every case of the successful use of climate knowledge has involved some kind of iteration between knowledge producers and knowledge users. And what Lisa's research examines is funding and institutional structures for science and whether those structures allow for the production of the right kinds of knowledge that are going to be useful. And I think that's a really important point for how we think about the relationship between science and policy, because it helps us debunk a really silly, simplistic, linear model of policy impact. And this is a bit unfair. It's a little bit of cherry picking. I'm taking one figure out of a much longer report. This was from a 2008 UK literature review, which was looking at the question of how might a researcher understand and demonstrate the impact of their work in policy. But I think it's a classic sort of linear model of how research leads to impact. So over here we have the input, which is the research funding, and then we have the output, and then outcomes start to happen, whether it's an initial outcome or an intermediate outcome. And then, of course, what happens is that as soon as we get from outputs into outcomes, we start to worry about attribution, and we get hung up on attribution, and we say, oh, it's really kind of impossible to know the further we get from the outputs, whether our outputs have had a big impact on the particular policy or the particular decision. But I think this kind of model is wrong in a number of fundamental ways. Firstly, it assumes that there's only one pathway, that it's a simple straight line from input to outcome, and that if you just follow that line, then you've got a chance of being on the right path. And there's nothing in here about, well, how do I choose which pathway I should be on in the beginning? It also assumes, I think, that there's no policy and politics in here, that somehow there's a pure bucket of money and researchers take that pure bucket of money and start to do research, and then outcomes start to happen. But of course, there's some consideration of the intended outcome in what gets funded in the first place. And I think a big issue for thinking about policy impact is closing the loop between outcomes and inputs and funding. And the literature backs this up. I mean, Lisa's work, for example, shows us very clearly that it's crucial to think about the way that funding is handed out and the institutions that hand out that funding when you're thinking about the impacts you're trying to create. And I think, again, we'll come back to this issue of attribution, but I think a lot of the research impact discussion at the moment kind of gets sort of derailed a little bit at the issue of attribution, and I'd like to propose a way beyond that, because I think that's not particularly constructive, and all, the last 20 or 30 years of research on the linking between research and policy shows us that it's actually not just a simple linear model from inputs to outcomes. Another framework that I'll just show you quickly, which again comes from this same kind of science policy literature. This is Roger Pielke's framework from his book, The Honest Broker, which I'm sure a lot of you have read, and I won't go over it in any great detail, but if you haven't, it's just a fantastic introduction to the relationships between science and policy and politics. And Roger kind of spends a chapter or two just debunking the kind of linear model of innovation and research policy, and also the linear model of science as an input to policy and a sort of uncertainty reducer in policy. And I think what's interesting about this model is that Roger is sort of saying there are a number of different pathways that a researcher can take when they're seeking to inform and influence policy. It's not just one. You make some choices, and actually the choice you make early on, even if it's not conscious, is going to determine later on how effective you can be in different kinds of engagement with government. And I think, again, it's important to think about the multiplicity of pathways and to think about the trade-offs that are inherent in those pathways. And Roger's not for a second saying that everyone should try and be an honest broker or everyone should try and be a pure scientist. All of these kind of roles are important if you're going to have a healthy relationship between research and policy in a functioning democracy. But there are some choices that are being made, and it's important to be clear about those up front. So this is the these are the lessons from the research side and the literature on the links between science and research and policy from the research side. But what strikes me looking at all of this is that it's a bit silent on the policy side. So these are some choices that we might make as researchers when we set out to do our work and to engage with government. But they don't have much to say about what's happening in the policy world. And if we're serious about policy impact, maybe we should be paying as much attention to what's happening in the policy world. So I just want to give a couple of models of that before I wrap up. So this is from a piece of work that was done last year in government, again led by the Innovation Department. And the report, which came out late last year, was about the place and the role of science in policy development in the Australian government. And it's actually a really good starting point for thinking about, well, what is the role of science in policy in the Australian public service, and how do we think about it, and how could it be improved? And the thing I just wanted to flag here, which I think is really interesting and hasn't, as far as I can tell, been done anywhere else much yet, is that the report uses this sort of simplified model of the policy cycle and holds up different modes of science and knowledge against that policy cycle and starts to sort of say, well, what might be useful at different points in the policy cycle? And that's not to say that no one's ever done this kind of thinking before, but I think it is really interesting to see this being reflected in the work the government itself is doing on the links between science and policy. I don't really want to get into an argument about the representation of the policy cycle, because I know public policy scholars love nothing more than arguing about the depiction of the policy cycle. I don't think that matters so much here. I think there's a multiple, infinite different ways of representing the policy process, but you can start to break it down a little bit and start to think about well, what kinds of work and knowledge and engagement might be most effective at different points in this process? And of course, the process in reality is probably never like the process on the page, but I still think there's potential there to take some of that thinking and provide some useful guidance to people. And maybe even to start to develop some sort of leading indicators of the types of engagement that are most likely to be effective at different points in this cycle or process. Again, as I said, others have written about this as well. This is work by Evert Lindquist, who's a public policy and administration researcher here at ANU and also in Canada. Evert breaks up the policy process into 4 what he calls modes, and then he starts to say, well, what kinds of knowledge and information and research might be most useful in these different modes? And this was from some work he did in the 90s for the Canadian International Development Research Centre, and they wanted some help thinking about, well, how might we show the impact that the research that we funded has actually had in policy. And Everett developed this framework as a way, a relatively simple way, with them to help start chunking up the kinds of activity that were going on and marry them up with different modes in the policy process. I think from doing that work, Everett was drawing on a sort of a literature in public policy and administration, which has a lot to tell us too about the way policy and government works and how we might think about the role of research in those processes. And Everett concludes that the multiplicity of actors in the policy process can be bewildering for researchers. But here, I mean, he's saying, you know, you need to be cognizant of the range of actors in any given sort of policy process. It's not just a simple researcher, policymaker. There you go. It's a much more complicated dynamic. And I think from doing that work with IDRC, Everett would say that, you know, this can get pretty complicated and pretty bewildering fairly quickly, but that it's important to understand this broader framework, because without it we're going to raise unrealistic expectations, both for ourselves and within government, about the kinds of impact that research can have. So I just want to quickly show you one final framework, and then we'll be done with frameworks, I promise. And this is, I think, the most important. This is work, as I said earlier, done in the 1970s in the social sciences. There's a paper by Carol Weiss from 1979, which I think does a better job of encapsulating the different ways that knowledge and research are used in policy than almost anything else I've read since. And she has this 7-part framework for thinking about the various ways that research is used in government. And I'm not going to go through each of the 7, but I just want to make 3 points by way of conclusion to this thinking about all the different frameworks that we might be able to use to help us think about policy impact. The first point, which I think is really important, is that Carol explicitly addresses the political dimension of research in policy. And I think that is often neglected in our thinking about linking research and policy, and also about sort of demonstrating policy impact. The second point is that Carol explicitly makes the point that research can have both positive and negative impacts in policy. And I think that's another thing that we rarely talk about. And finally, she deals here in these 2 points at the bottom with what she would call the enlightenment function of research, which is to say that actually the impact that research has in policy might take a long time, and it might be indirect, and it might be the result of ideas from the research community percolating through society and a whole range of groups and actors and networks, and eventually shaping and reshaping the way we think about a particular issue, and also shaping and reshaping the way governments think about their scope of action within that particular issue. And I think this sort of research utilisation thinking from the 70s is now starting to show up in how people are thinking about measuring policy impact and measuring research impact. So this is a slide that I've stolen from a colleague at the UK Economic and Social Research Council. And I think you can see here a sort of thread from Carol Weiss's work through to the ways in which the research councils in the UK are now starting to think about, well, how might we actually measure impact in a really structured, systematic way? And you can see there's this sort of conceptual dimension of impact, which is very much the sort of enlightenment model of Carol's work and others. There's a sort of more instrumental dimension where you might actually be able to track the impact in a change in legislation or policy in a shorter time period. There's a capacity building element, which again goes back to my comments earlier about the role of, say, universities in teaching and training, which is important, I think. And there's these other ways that impact might be created in terms of cultural change and supporting connectivity between other players in a policy system. So I think this is the point at which we can kind of stop in our drawing on the literature and say, well, okay, so it seems to me that some of the best thinking from the relevant literature is now being picked up, and people are actually thinking about, okay, how would we actually go about implementing and measuring some of this stuff? And what effect might that have on the behaviour of the system that we're trying to measure? But this is also the point at which it kind of gets a bit complicated. And I do want to make the point that I think there's a danger in jumping to simple metrics when it comes to research impact assessment. But I don't want to just end by saying, oh, it's really complicated, because that would be the point at which anyone who's actually trying to do anything about this would say, thank you very much, that's extraordinarily unhelpful. So I would like to finish with 5 key points that I think come out of this work and the different perspectives in a whole range of literatures. They're not 5 key metrics, they're not the 5 answers, but I think they're 5 principles that should inform any framework for research impact assessment and policy impact assessment, whether that framework be at the level of a university or a research program or the federal government. So, number 1, I think it's clear from all of the research and all of the activity that's happening that it can't be one size fits all. There's a diversity of models, there's a diversity of approaches, so it has to be horses for courses. And I think we can't try and force one size fits all on a system which encompasses a whole range of diversity. There is an important role for research to critique policy, as Carol Weiss reminds us. There's also a really important role for research to provide useful knowledge and sort of instrumental, useful outputs for the work of government, and that's a more constructive, practical, direct role. Both those things are important, and we need a framework that can encompass both those things. Direct engagement and impact is important, but again, impact might be really indirect and diffuse. And capacity building is another important part. And these things, I think, can't all be measured the same way. So there has to be a system that allows for some diversity. Secondly, the second principle, I think, that is evident from the literature and from the thinking that's been done on this, is that research is not a pizza. It's not a product. We don't do research, package it up, go to the door of government, knock on the door, hand over the pizza, and walk away. Jonathan Lomas reminds us that research is a process, not a product. And he also reminds us that policy is a process, not an event. So we're talking about processes interacting. And colleagues in New Zealand in the Crown Research Institutes who've been thinking a lot about how do you measure the impact of the work they do have pointed out that we need to move away from a goods mentality to a services mentality. It's not about products that are neatly packaged. It's about engagement and process. And I think my third principle relates to this too. And that would be that I think context matters. All the research says that if you want to have an impact in policy or you want to have constructive engagement with policy, you need to understand the context of the policymaker. You need to allow for that kind of iterative debate and dialogue, and you need to let the policymaker or the decision maker contextualise the knowledge in their own environment, otherwise it's not going to have the impact. And I think, and I could be wrong, but I suspect that even if you want to criticise government or criticise policy or bring the knowledge from your research to bear in a way which helps highlight the flaws in a policy, you still are probably going to be more effective doing that if you actually understand what the policy is that you're criticising. So I think we have to kind of know what's behind the door. It's not just a question of walking up to the door and handing over the box and walking away. The fourth point is that I think where we do set out to have an impact and inform and influence policy and to create useful and usable research and knowledge for government and for policy, the lesson there is that we need to allow for iteration and engagement on the way through. All the literature says that you're most likely to achieve that kind of impact if you've engaged with the policymaker from the very beginning. And again, to go back to that linear model, it's not like you get your funding, you do your research, you package up your output, and then you engage. You're much more likely to have the impact if you're engaging all the way through. And I think we probably will need new metrics for that, and there are people who are working on this kind of thing already. But I think there's a tremendous promise in that, because if what we're trying to do is encourage and support this productive interaction between researchers and policymakers, then maybe instead of getting hung up on attribution, the thing we should be looking for is contribution. And there's a whole bunch of evidence in the literature, again, which supports this move from attribution to contribution. We had a workshop last week where we had a whole range of organisations from across government that have an explicit role to link research and policy. And one of the key messages from that discussion was that really we should stop talking about evidence-based policy, because policy is informed and based in a whole bunch of things, not just evidence. But we could be talking about evidence-informed policy, and we could be measuring a contribution to evidence-informed policy. And that would be something that I think is a sort of a practical step that's doable. And people are working on metrics of that kind of productive engagement. And I think in addition to saying some things about the quality of research, we also know some things about assessing the quality of that engagement. And this takes me to my final point. And I think it's a question for all of us, both in the research community and in government. And it's really to ask, why are we doing this anyway? What are we measuring impact for? I think there's a strong sense that evidence-informed policy is really important. And we see this borne out in the literature, and we see it in agendas of public service reform, and we see it in a whole range of efforts by government to improve the way that government does its own business. We also see it in the missions of places like this, the Crawford School, which definitely sees as part of its role to society to be working with government and informing policy processes. So I think we need to be clear about what it is we're actually trying to do. Are we trying to collect a handful of positive, good news story case studies? Or are we trying to do something deeper and actually shape the way that investments in research lead to the kinds of outcomes we want? And if it's the latter, if it's the former, I think we can just collect some case studies. If it's the latter, I think it really begs a question about what kind of system and framework we need, because that starts to sound a lot to me like best practice evaluation, starting with the end in mind and having an investment and planning and management and evaluation system which helps support people along the way to improve what they're doing, to be rewarded for doing the right things, and to maximise their chances of having the kind of impact that we want them to have. And so if I can just stretch the metaphor one little bit further by way of conclusion, I think the impact door is open. And the horse is bolted. And we helped open it in the research community. You know, we've talked a lot about the sort of social contract for publicly funded research. And we've talked a lot about impact. And I think the community is kind of expecting us to have something to say about it now that the door is open. And my entreaty to all of us is that I think we have to get better at this. And if we don't do it ourselves, someone else is going to do it to us. So it's incumbent on us to try and think through these processes more clearly and think about how that's reflected in what we invest, how we manage research, how we plan and evaluate research, so that we can achieve the kinds of policy impact that we really want to. Thanks.